I'm Hannu Larsson, and this is part 3 in the lecture series on qualitative interviews. And in this part, I will be talking about asking questions, or in other words, how to perform an interview. And this will probably be the longest little mini lecture. Again, looking at the Myers and Newman model, we will be, attending all of these aspects. The meaning of situating the researcher, the minimal social dissonance, use of mirroring questions, and flexibility, as well as this issue, as well as strength of everyone being an interpreter. Let's get to it. Schultz and Avital argues that a good qualitative interview should be grounded in the participants' own experiences, should acknowledge and value participants' narratives and constructions or reconstructions of their experiences. That is, how they tell you about something. They are the experts here. Coming back again to this thing that we talked about in previous lectures, that we should have flexibility. We should allow them to help you, allow them to take a part in guiding this discussion onward, especially if we are talking about higher levels of flexibility. And a good quality interview should also provide an explicit framework for guiding participants to articulate and interpret their experiences. And this framework could be a conceptual one, a theoretical one, or the questions you ask should be, not unfamiliar to the respondents. They should be able to understand what you're actually asking, and you should speak their language in a way, so that you can actually help them in interpreting and articulating what they want to say. And we'll get back to a bit on how to do that in practice in terms of asking, for instance, probing questions. A key question to ask yourself, and that I would ask somebody who had designed an interview study, is, why are you asking these questions? Quite often, I would say in thesis projects and in papers as well, in research papers, there's a lack of motivation for questions being asked. Questions always have or come from somewhere, from some kind of assumption. It could be a formal theory that has been made explicit, a model, or your own knowledge of a certain case. You should make this explicit and also motivate it. But questions can, of course, strive at the same time to be more inductive, to be less, influenced by theory, in a field where theory is lacking, for instance. But you always carry with you some kind of assumptions, at least if you take an interpretive stance doing qualitative research. And we're also going to, in the grounded theory lecture, look more into this struggle to avoid being biased by theory from the start. So, let's get more into the meat of the interview. How do we move through this situation? Should we start out with simple questions? Or should we perhaps start out with wider questions, allowing the informant to take control of the situation? Simple questions could be like, okay, hi, what's your name? Something that's easy to get things going, break the ice. On the other hand, maybe that's something that you do outside of an interview situation, just shake hands when you get there. The other approach, this asking wider questions, could be, could you tell me about something, a bit about what you work with? Opening up for them to tell you not really the life story, but essentially a longer take on who they are and what they're doing in this particular organization. Both of these, of course, have their pros and cons. You should always be sure to only ask one question at a time. It should be clear to the respondent what you're actually asking about. However, there can be some mismatches, there can be misunderstandings, and you, as an interviewer, you can't have any prestige going into an interview. You are not all-knowing in any way, but you're there to learn. You should not risk to misinterpret the informant. So if something is unclear, ask again. And again, we'll get back to how to ask follow-up questions later on. You should also, in a way comfortable to you and what you feel is possible and suitable in this situation, try to keep notes, which I'll talk more about in part 4 of this interview series, lecture series. So let's get back to these different styles of interviews. We had the structured, semi-structured, unstructured. What way should you go about it? And the answer, of course, that it depends. Do you have a theoretical framework at hand? Does that provide you with some kind of framing or theoretical assumptions to ask questions based on? Or is it important to cover certain topics? Do you have a checklist of things that you need to have discussed in an interview in order to answer a certain research question? Or do you need the informant to tell you what is important? So again, we have this flexibility issue. Do we want you as a researcher to direct this interview, or do we want the informant to be more in charge of it? And this can, of course, vary during an interview situation or between different interviews. And there's the, should we say, conversation part of it to some extent, which we'll get back to. But let's think a bit about this situating the researcher, the role and identity. Myers and Newman states that everyone is an interpreter, essentially saying that an interview is a two-way, but if you're two people at least, a two-way communication. If we see the little stick figure to the left here and the stick figure to the right, we said that the stick figure to the left is me being the researcher, and the stick figure to the right is somebody I'm interviewing. When I ask a question, I perform a speech act, which has to be interpreted, understood by the person being interviewed. The response, again, is a speech act, which I, as a researcher, have to understand. And probably, if I'm not entirely familiar with this context, and the person being interviewed is not familiar with my background or perhaps my theoretical framework or assumptions, that is most probably implicit to me. There might be some dissonance, some problems in communicating here. We might be using concepts that we're not at all familiar with. They might be using certain acronyms based in their organization that I'm not at all aware of. Or I might be using some kind of scientific language that is not entirely suitable for this type of conversation. So, questions must be understood in order to be useful. Answers must also be understood. So that's why it's so important to ask again. And, not the least, show interest. Show that you are there to learn from the person you're interviewing. You are not the authority here. You're not somebody who is interrogating them. That's not the kind of interview this is. It's a learning opportunity for you. So, let's look at some tools, at least try to probe a bit deeper into trying to understand, trying to make sure that you're understood or what the problems might be. We can deal with prompts, probes, and checks. And she would say things to help out could be to start out with, of course, informing what is this interview about, even though you probably have had a discussion beforehand, either through the manager or through their direct communication, what this interview is supposed to be about. Inform them again. Give them the opportunity to ask questions. And perhaps in a formal or informal way, start asking simple questions to get the conversation going, to get them feeling comfortable and not having this feeling of being interrogated by you. Make sure to pose one question at a time and avoid leading questions, which is something that is, of course, easier to do if you prepare questions beforehand, but might be harder to do if you have a more flexibility in the interview situation. If you're not sure what this person is talking about, or if you have some other insecurities, you can try these prompts, probes, and checks. Prompts, trying to get the person talking more. Don't be afraid of silence. Don't be afraid of taking a break to take some notes. Just because the person has paused for a few seconds does not mean that she or he is not going to continue talking, because they probably take a break thinking. And being silent can actually probe them or prompt them to tell you more about a certain thing. Or you can just be supporting in terms of saying, interesting, good, yeah, As when I do interviews, I hear myself in recordings that I tend to go, mhm, 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 for a long period of time, prompting the interview to often talk quite a bit more. Again, coming back to what level of flexibility that is desirable in this particular interview. You can have probes. Could you give me some examples of that? Or could you give us some more details about that? If you're not entirely sure what they're talking about, or if you just want to get some more insight into something they mentioned in passing. Again, important to take note because it might not be suitable to ask these probing questions right away in the situation, but coming back to it later, so make a note of it. And the checks. Again, they might be using a language that you're not familiar with, or you might get the sense that they've misinterpreted your question. If I understand you correctly, did you mean it this way? So what this means is that, or perhaps when coming to the end of the interview or trying to summarize a longer statement. So in summary, this means that. Again, this is just some simple language tools to use in order to get into you talking more and elaborating on something they've said or clarifying certain things, making sure, at least trying to make sure that you haven't misinterpreted things. So, this was just a short overview of how you can go about the interview situation itself. Thanks for listening.